David Wood had a debate with Shabir Ally. And I could have told you, since it was on the crucifixion, exactly what was going to happen. I debated Shabir on this. Though it's interesting, I think there has been some change. I think Shabir has gotten more and more and more and more and more willing to use a wild range of ultra-liberal, utterly incoherent scholarship. I mean, Shabir's given up, quite honestly, on even trying to present, even pretending to present a consistent perspective. I mean, I remember quoting to him, maybe in our first debate, maybe in a second, his own quotation to Robert Morey years and years and years ago, when Morey made an attack upon the Quran. His response was that you need to engage in meaningful exegesis. You can't force external sources upon the text of the Quran. So he knew exactly what needed to be done, but since he just won't do that with the New Testament at all, I think he's just given up on even bothering. And so I mean, when you're quoting people who don't even believe Jesus existed as some of your sources, Dr. Price, who I've debated, when you're quoting Price as one of your sources, as a Muslim, I give up. I mean, you aren't even pretending any longer to use any kind of consistency in the sources you're using. It's just, I'll throw everything at you, including the kitchen sink, and it doesn't matter if everything I throw at you is utterly contradictory to everything I believe. I'll still use it. It's a shame. Anyway, so I didn't get to watch most of that debate because I switched over once I heard about what Josh was doing. But there's always Q&A. Always Q&A in debates. It's sort of how many debates die slowly. Instead of ending, they just die slowly. And so here is a question that was asked. And so I'll let you hear the question. Then we'll listen to David's response. Then I'll go more slowly through Shabir's reply, because two of the things we're going to look at on the subject of Islam today are relevant to the crucifixion. And what they both communicate to us, and what we're going to see is, here's Shabir Ally, Dr. Shabir Ally, educated in the, secular university up there in Canada, widely read, can quote all sorts of different sources, even though the sources all contradict each other, but he can quote from all in many ways. And then we're going to have a Muslim from down in Australia who clearly hasn't read almost anything from the Christian perspective at all. And yet both completely miss the heart of the Christian perspective. And Muslims that will watch this and are watching it right now, you need to understand, when you guys tilt at windmills, when you burn straw men, where'd my straw man go? When you're going after guys like this, especially when it comes to the cross and consistently, that tells us that you don't have a real good argument against the reality of what we believe. Now, I will admit, this is not the case with Shabir, because almost everything Shabir says, I have dialogued with him about and refuted him on in the past. So that doesn't matter. But the fellow down in Australia, maybe all the Christians he's talked to have really not had a meaningful understanding of the atonement. I've often said, you can hear in the sermons that I've delivered on this subject over the decades, that I think most evangelical Christians have a sentimental doctrine of the atonement, not a biblical or theological doctrine of the atonement. Okay, so maybe if that's, it's like when I talk to a Muslim in South Africa, I cannot assume that they have dialogued with a Christian who's even properly Trinitarian, given the state of the church in South Africa. Now, there are good churches in South Africa, just not many of them. They're in a small minority, unfortunately, in comparison to the word faith stuff and the general shape of charismatic churches in South Africa, which is pathetic. So I understand if that's all you've ever heard. And my hope is that in providing a response, maybe you'll be prompted to do some serious reading. I don't expect the vast majority of Muslims to go read John Owen. They're not going to understand John Owen. Most Christians don't understand John Owen. But there are good works on the subject that would help them to understand a whole lot better than the way they are. So anyways, let's dive into this. Here's the question and the dialogue.
How do we understand the claim that Jesus, peace be upon him, was crucified on a cross, tree, or pole in light of Deuteronomy chapter 21, verses 22 and 23, and Galatians chapter 3, verse 13, which states that whoever is hung on a tree or pole or cross is cursed? Thank you.
Well, I'd say you're about that close to understanding the gospel, right? Because we know Jesus is righteous according to both the Bible and the Quran. Muhammad in the Hadith said that Satan touches everyone who comes into the world, but he couldn't touch Jesus or his mother. Everyone else, Muhammad, everyone, Satan could touch him, but not Jesus.
I didn't see all the ads when I first watched it.
You're right. How do we reconcile our belief that Jesus was righteous with the Old Testament claim that anyone who's hung on a tree is cursed? And it seems that we would have to say that Jesus...
Now, yeah, I didn't even notice all this because I could care less about... Like I said, these are the guys that had the weird, hey, he gets destroyed, all this stuff. What was useful is the stuff over here on the side. And that is Deuteronomy 21, and if a man have committed a sin worthy of death, and they didn't even put it up there, and he be to be put to death, and thou hang him, they even use King James, hang him on a tree, his body shall not remain all night upon the tree, but thou shalt in any wise bury him that day, for he that is hanged is accursed of God, that thy land be not defiled, which the Lord thy God giveth thee for an inheritance. And then Galatians 3:13, Christ hath redeemed us from the curse of the law, being made a curse for us, for it is written, cursed is everyone that hangeth on a tree. So the point is that Muslims struggle at this point with understanding what Christians believe about this. It's a shame to me that many Christians struggle to answer. But what you need to understand, what we're going to see a couple times here over the next, this video and the next, is that the voluntary nature of the self-giving of the Son in perfect union with the will of the Father through the work and cooperation of the Holy Spirit is not a part of the Muslims' understanding of Christian theology. Even though you can, all I got to do is go read Augustine. Augustine wrote hundreds of years before your prophet came along. So here's somebody, we don't even have to argue interpretations here. Very clearly, the most important Christian writer between Paul and the days of Muhammad made this very plain. It's not difficult to find. This is not a disputable issue. Christians believed that Father, Son, and Spirit together were involved, that the Son voluntarily, I mean, it's directly stated in Scripture, he made himself of no reputation. That uses what's called a reflexive pronoun. This is something that the Son himself did. He took on human flesh. He had the divine power to be able to do that. I know that's not the Jesus that you believe in, because you don't believe in the Jesus of the apostles. But the Jesus of the Bible had the ability to do that. He does it voluntarily. And so all this stuff about God committing suicide and the Son being abused by the Father and all the rest of this stuff, utterly irrelevant to what Christianity actually believes. It's straw man. It is not worthy of being repeated in the future on your part. When you repeat it, what you're doing from your perspective is little more than what some Christians do in attacking the worst misunderstandings of Islamic theology and practice and making them normative for all Muslims, ignoring the fact that there are Muslim scholars, there's Muslim jurisprudence, There are Muslim works down through the ages that have obviously expressed many of these beliefs in a much more consistent and meaningful fashion, relating various elements of Islamic tradition and theology together in a much more consistent whole. You're just doing the same thing reverse. As long as all of us keep doing that, we're never going to accomplish anything unless it's your purpose just to keep Muslims and Christians, and we just keep lobbing bombs at each other. I guess I shouldn't use that term, but verbal bombs on the internet. If that's what you want, then that's what we'll get. But if the real question is, do you want to be truthful? I've mentioned many times before, one of the 99 beautiful names, Al-Haq, the truth. You want to be truthful? Your own faith seems to indicate that this should be something that is of a high priority to you. So this is where the confusion is coming from, and David is seeking to address that in his response.
Jesus was cursed in spite of being righteous, and that's exactly what the gospel says, right? The one who was without sin became sin for us. So, yeah, if we left those things out, and you would wonder, oh, was Jesus cursed? Well, Jesus was righteous, and yet he was cursed. And notice he was hung on a tree, according to Shabir as well. So he's under a curse, according to both.
Now, let me just mention, it's one of the reasons it makes it difficult to debate Shabir Ally on this, is he does not hold the standard Sunni position on this. He does believe Jesus was crucified. He just swooned. He didn't die. Vast majority of Sunni Muslims do not believe that Jesus was hung upon a tree. They believe he was taken up to heaven. Someone else was made to look like Jesus. I think Shabir recognizes it's next to impossible to defend that idea from a historical perspective. So maybe that's why he takes the Ahmadi take a similar perspective. Wouldn't be identical, but similar perspective. As Shabir. So when you debate Shabir on the subject, you end up not really addressing most of the Sunni Muslims in the audiences. That's what he was just mentioning, that even Shabir believes that he was hung upon a tree.
Views on the stage tonight. And so if Jesus was under a curse, well, what do we do there? In Christianity, he's under a curse for a reason, right? He's under a curse for a reason because he's becoming a curse for us, right? So that we can be forgiven.
See, what I would emphasize there in David's response is the freeness, the voluntariness of this action, both on the part of the Father and the Son. That this is not the Son being forced to do something. That this is the central mechanism whereby Father, Son, and Spirit bring about their own self-glorification. And this was chosen, they chose to do this in eternity past. And so when you have a strong doctrine of the atonement and understand the book of Hebrews and what it teaches, then it is that freedom of God that is expressed, in the cross that I think can really help Muslims understand this. Now, let me just mention something. Especially when we look at the second video. The second video, honestly, is... It's not on the level of the Black Hebrew Israelites, but as far as understanding of Christian theology, it sort of is. And I don't say that disrespectfully. It's just the fact, as we're gonna point out. And for a lot of people, especially if you don't live in an area where there's a lot of Muslim immigrants or something like that, where you just haven't had any interaction with folks, the question might cross your mind, why even bother? I mean, this is so far out from a truthful representation, but you have to recognize, remember, what year was that? 99, that long line of Muslims staying there getting ready to ask me questions in a very warm, humid church building on Long Island. and the guy asking about the fig tree, and the fig tree question, and then to me, still one of the most hilarious of my debate experiences, the guy who goes on and on and on to eventually get around to asking, was Jesus a white man or a black man? It took him 5 minutes, and in the process, he's gesturing so much that he hits the microphone, which is a wireless microphone, and it goes flying down, and he has to go run after the microphone and go get it. It was hilarious. But what it illustrated all the way back then, and I look back on it now and go, oh, man, did I have a lot to learn at that point in time. And here was the beginning of my education, was what are you going to do with these folks? The sad tendency, let's be honest, let me talk to my fellow Calvinists here. The sad tendency amongst us is to go, beneath me, not worth my time, not worth my time. They are worth your time. There is a huge difference between the errors we're going to see in the second video we're going to look at in a moment, which is on the same subject, and the attitude of those black Hebrew Israelites. This is based upon ignorance. It's based upon tradition. It's not the kind of white devil stuff. Now, there are Muslims that get down there too. The ones that every other word is kafir and just have this obviously deep detestation of any Christian at all. They don't make any distinction between us or anything else. There's some that get down there too, obviously. But there are many, especially those who come from other nations. It's all they know. It's all they know. So keep that in mind as we address this.
As far as other interpretations, I guess he's under a curse because he was hung on a tree, but I don't know. Shabir's about to answer, so he can explain what he would think about Jesus being hung on a tree.
I agree that Jesus was righteous, and I don't agree that he was a curse. And the Deuteronomy passage actually refers to a person who was hung justly for his crimes. So he's under the curse of God, according to Deuteronomy. Paul misunderstood this, and though Jesus was unjustly hung, Paul said Jesus became a curse, but he's a curse for us. But that's problematic because...
Now, notice, for Shabir, Paul is the big baddie. Now, I've never seen Shabir even attempt to be fair to Paul at all. There are excellent works. In fact, I would suggest that for anyone who's going to be involved in Muslim apologetics, the books, Paul, Apostle, The Heart Set Free, F.F. Bruce, and then those that have been done since then, that are fair biblical examinations of just a chosen servant and apostle of Jesus Christ. I mean, when you're dealing with Muslim apologetics today, you're going to be dealing with people who have been poisoned, incoherently poisoned against the Apostle Paul. They will not read a word he says with the slightest bit of fairness. And unfortunately, they draw from a whole range of anti-Paul rhetoric that is common in modern day theology. And so he says, Paul did not understand. Paul perfectly understood this. Paul read Hebrew better than Shabir ever will. Paul was trained the feet of Gamaliel. He fully knew what the context was. The point was that the methodology of death demonstrated the cursedness of the person who died in this fashion. And Paul's whole argument in Galatians 3 is Christ has borne the curse of the law in his body upon the tree in our place. Therefore, the idea of our having to enter into the old covenant and keep the law and be circumcised and do all the rest of this stuff so as to actuate something on Christ's part, there is nothing we can add to what Christ has accomplished in his voluntary self-giving upon the cross. He has borne in himself. Now, this requires Jesus to be a whole lot greater than the Muslim Jesus. There's no question about that. A Jesus who, where is it, going off the top of my head, I didn't look it up, but I think in that hadith where Muhammad goes through the levels of heaven, and, when he finally gets to Allah, he's given, 50 prayers and 30 prayers, and he and Moses have that thing that sort of looks like it's sort of based a little bit on what happened with Abraham and Yahweh in regards to Sodom and Gomorrah and stuff. Finally whittle the number of prayers down to 5 and all the rest of that stuff. But if I recall correctly, Jesus wasn't on the top level of heaven. If I recall correctly, he was on the second, wasn't it? I'm just going off the top of my head. I didn't look it up. I think it was on the second level. A second level of heaven Jesus is not who Paul's talking about. It's not who Mark's talking about, as we'll see here a little bit later on in the program. It's not who anybody in the New Testament is talking about. The deified, de-prophesied, de-exalted Jesus that Muhammad came up with is not the Jesus of the New Testament. This is one of the primary issues anyone examining the truth claims of Judaism, Christianity, and Islam has to recognize. Again, that massive chasm that exists between the fulfillment in the New Testament of the prophecies of the Old and the utter lack of knowledge on the part of the author of the Quran of what's in what the Quran says was sent down by God. This is the issue. And the Jesus of the Bible, the mighty God of Isaiah 9:6, the Emmanuel of not only Isaiah 7, but all the way through Isaiah 11, that one who is seen then in the New Testament consistently as a fulfillment of that Old Testament prophecy. No knowledge of that going into the Quran. The Jesus of the Quran is not sufficient to explain the cross. No question about it. And as long as all you have is the Jesus of the Quran, the cross will be absolutely mysterious to you. But the wonderful thing is, and the really wonderful thing is, there are going to be Muslims who are going to listen to this and they're not going to hear a word that I'm saying. And that's sad. But the wonderful thing is, when the Spirit of God chooses to reveal the Lord of glory to a Muslim person, there's no power in heaven and earth that can stop that from happening. When the powerful Spirit of God applies the gospel, raises that person from spiritual death to spiritual life, I feel sorry for anybody who has a rationalistic view of doing apologetics, where you're looking at numbers and stuff like that. All we've got to do is proclaim the truth, and the Spirit of God can make that to come alive in people's hearts and minds. So, no, Paul didn't misunderstand anything. And it is a misunderstanding of Galatians 3 and of the gospel as a whole that is in play here on Shabir's part.
Dr. William Lane Craig asserts, you cannot just simply say that Jesus got up and rose from the dead on his own. God had to raise him from the dead. But as I pointed out...
Now, I'm not sure why he's mentioning... Shabir name drops. Any Christian scholar will tell you that the resurrection is a Trinitarian act. The Spirit of God raised Jesus from the dead. The same Spirit that's active in believers. Jesus received his life back. The Father raised the Son from the dead. Father, Son, Spirit. Oh, Trinitarian action. So, why even throw Craig's name in there? I don't know. What's the point there? I don't know, but there you go.
To him, for God to raise him from the dead, God has to want to raise him from the dead. And
the Father has to want to raise the Son from the dead. So the Son is doing the exact will of the Father. This is exactly what the Father, Son, and Spirit have covenanted together to do in eternity past. Every one of the Gospels, including Mark, makes it so obviously plain Jesus says it is necessary for the Son of Man to go to Jerusalem and to be betrayed in the hands of men and to die and to rise again the third day. Matthew, Mark, Luke, John, they all say the same thing. Nothing that comes from the first century contradicts it. Nothing historically at all. Zip, zero, nada. You got zip. Everything consistently points to the same thing. And so there's no way to honestly deal with any of the New Testament documents. And the Quran has no knowledge of these things, so it can't give you any information. All you got's the weird 40 words in Surah 4 of 1-7 that no one really knows what it actually means. And if you accept that as historically valid and then reject the stuff that comes from the first century, don't even pretend to be doing history, because you're not. You're just doing religion at that point. Everything from back there says the same thing. The consistent teaching is that this was the intention. And so the Father has to want to raise the Son. The Son's done exactly what the Father and the Son and the Spirit determined was going to take place. Even the early church confesses this in Acts chapter 4. And so here's introducing some kind of odd thing that has no basis in anything that comes from the first century at all. What do you accomplish by doing that?
If all we know is that he died under the curse of God according to your scriptures, you have no reason for thinking that God would want to raise the accursed person from the dead who died under the curse of his own law.
Except for the fact that the Son voluntarily took that law to bring about the redemption of all of God's people, which was God's purpose before creation itself. I mean, honestly, this is only meant to keep Muslims confused and to have an impact upon Christians who are, in the very words of the New Testament, untaught and unstable. Untaught and unstable. When your apologetic is aimed at the foot of your opponent rather than the head, it tells you a little something about the nature of your apologetic. Really does. Really does.
So you have a contradiction here, and it's a major one, and that's another reason for...
Where? We haven't heard a word. Where is the contradiction? We haven't seen anything. Not a shred. In everything that's been said at this point, Shabir hasn't given us anything in this answer that is at all a contradiction.
For believing that Jesus was not raised from the dead, and it's better to think that he did not die in the first place.
Again, thank you guys so much. Appreciate it.
Okay, so there you go. There's that. How anybody could go, wow, oh man, just wiped him out. It's just like, you're not really listening with critical thinking capacities operational here, are you? I mean, this is the only way you could look at that and go, oh, that was awesome, is if you have such deep prejudice that you're just desperately searching for something to hold on to.